good evening, and welcome back. Tonight, as the world slows down and your eyes grow heavy, we'll travel to a place where time once moved with the rhythm of the sea. A quiet northern shore, where the wind hums softly through the pines, and the waves carry stories long forgotten. This is not a tale of conquest or battle, but of silence, the calm after the storm of history. As you listen, you may feel your body relax, your breath slow, and the distant crackle of an imagined fire wrapping you in warmth. You are safe here, resting inside the quiet of the past. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Is it late evening, or the gentle hours before dawn? Wherever you are in the world, I'm grateful you're here. Before we drift deeper into history, if you enjoy calm stories like this, you can press like or subscribe. No need to do it now, maybe later, once you've drifted to sleep under the sound of the waves. Now, imagine a coastline covered in morning mist. The air smells of salt and pine, and the cold breeze feels older than memory itself. Once, these shores were alive with movement, the pounding of hammers on wood, the laughter of sailors, the creak of ships preparing to leave the harbor. But now, there is only stillness. The sea is the same, yet everything feels different. The sun rises slowly over the fjord, painting the water in silver. The world looks peaceful, almost frozen in time. Somewhere out there, the last traces of the Viking age are fading, not with thunder, but with a whisper. You can almost hear it in the rhythm of the tide, soft and constant, like a lullaby made of wind and water. It's a strange kind of peace, the kind that follows after centuries of motion. Once, these people crossed oceans and returned with stories of lands beyond the horizon. But now, the horizon only holds memory. The sails have vanished, and the harbors sleep. The people who remain wake quietly to another cold morning, unaware that their world has already begun to fade into legend. Somewhere, an old ship rests against the shore. Its wood is worn smooth by years of tide and time. The paint has long peeled away, revealing the grain beneath, pale and tired. No one comes to repair it. No one remembers the names of those who once built it. The sea rocks it gently, as if cradling a memory it refuses to let go. And as you listen, perhaps you can imagine the sound of that wooden hull moving with the water, slow, rhythmic, steady, like breathing, like the heartbeat of the past. The waves wash in, then drift away again. You can almost hear the distant call of seabirds and the soft crackle of a fire somewhere behind you. Everything feels both ancient and close, like a dream you've almost remembered. The northern air was once filled with purpose, ships to build, journeys to begin. But time, as it always does, softened everything. What was once adventure became routine, and what was once memory became silence. The people who lived here turned from explorers to caretakers, from sailors to storytellers. Every community along the coast once had a sound, hammers, laughter, voices carried by wind. But one by one, those sounds faded. People stayed closer to home. The world outside grew larger, faster, louder, until these small northern towns were left behind. Forgotten not because they vanished, but because the world simply moved on. If you close your eyes now, you might feel what they felt, the quiet pride of people who lived close to the earth and the sea. Their world was small, but rich with rhythm. The morning chores, the scent of fish drying in the sun, the long winter evenings by the fire. In that simplicity, there was peace. Sometimes, forgetting doesn't come suddenly. It creeps in softly, like snow falling overnight. One morning, someone looks around and realizes the old songs aren't sung anymore. The boats have stopped being built. The children don't ask about the old voyages. The past begins to drift away, like mist over the water. The wind still carries the scent of salt. The sea still moves with the same ancient patience. But there are fewer footprints on the sand. The stones that once held ropes and anchors are now covered in moss. The harbors that once guided brave travelers now hold only the reflection of clouds. As you breathe slowly and listen, you might notice how calm the silence feels. The kind of calm that doesn't ask to be filled. It simply exists, like the air after a storm or the hush before dawn. This was the silence that greeted the north when the last sails disappeared. And though the world forgot the Vikings, the sea did not. It kept their rhythm in its waves, their courage in its depths. Every tide that reaches the shore carries a piece of their memory, not in glory or noise, but in quiet endurance. The same endurance you feel now, as you settle deeper into rest. If your thoughts begin to wander, that's all right. You're meant to drift, just as history drifts, gently and without resistance. The fire crackles softly in your mind, and the northern wind hums through unseen trees. The story will wait for you. Take one more breath, slow and steady. Let the sea inside this story rock you towards sleep. We'll continue soon, to the day when the last longship left its harbor and the north grew quiet forever. The tide moves in and out, patient and unbothered by the passing of centuries. Somewhere beneath those cold waves lie fragments of wood, bits of rope, and the quiet traces of what once was a harbor. The world above continues without noticing, as if the sea has decided to keep its own memories hidden, resting in peace beneath layers of time and salt. Morning comes softly, lighting the mountains in pale gold. Smoke rises from small homes near the coast, not from forges or ships, but from warm fires inside simple cottages. The people here no longer speak of journeys or horizons. Their days are measured by the rhythm of the seasons, planting, fishing, and waiting for the thaw. The sea, once their road to the world, is now only a mirror for the sky. You might feel your breath slow again as you picture this place. The cold air, the sound of distant gulls, the creak of wood. It's easy to forget that these small, ordinary lives were built by those who once ruled the waves. Yet this simplicity carries its own kind of power, a quiet dignity that lingers long after the noise of history fades away. Every so often, the wind still brings something familiar, a faint sound, like the flap of a sail or the echo of oars cutting through water. It's only the wind, of course, moving through the fjords. But in that moment, it feels like time folds back on itself, letting the past breathe for a heartbeat before drifting away again. Somewhere on the cliffs, an old carving still survives, a ship roughly etched into the stone. The lines are faint now, softened by rain and wind. No one remembers who carved it, or when. Yet, when the sunlight touches it at just the right angle, it glows faintly, as if the stone itself remembers what the world has chosen to forget. If you're still awake, you may notice how steady your breathing has become. That's the rhythm of these stories, slow, patient, like the sea itself. The world doesn't rush here. It waits. It remembers in silence. As years passed, travelers from far lands stopped visiting these northern shores. Maps changed. Names shifted. The centers of power moved elsewhere. The people here didn't vanish. They simply became smaller in the world's memory. Yet in every word, in every language touched by the North, a shadow of their legacy remains. In the evenings, the families by the shore would gather by the fire. They'd speak softly, their voices blending with the wind. The stories they told were not of heroes or battles anymore, but of harvests, of storms survived, of neighbors helped. Their world became smaller, but perhaps it also became kinder. There's a lesson in that, somewhere, that history doesn't always end with a crash or a cry. Sometimes it simply settles down to rest, quietly, respectfully, letting new stories grow from the old. The people of the North didn't disappear. They just learned to live more gently with the sea. Now and then, a traveler would arrive, a fisherman, a merchant, and ask, who built these harbors? But no one could quite remember. The names had slipped away, passed down through too many winters. All that remained was the shape of their work, still standing against the wind, still holding firm after centuries. If your thoughts begin to drift, let them. This is a safe place to wander. The sound of waves, the steady hum of history, the warmth of an unseen fire, they all belong to the same rhythm. A rhythm meant to calm the heart and slow the mind. Somewhere in that quiet, the last echo of the Viking world still exists. Not in legend or treasure, but in the simple persistence of life itself, the act of staying, of enduring, of tending to what remains. That's where real history sleeps, in the small moments that never make it to the books. As the day fades to twilight, the northern light softens again. The mist returns, wrapping the coast in its pale blanket. You can almost hear the ocean breathing, like an old friend whispering goodnight. The shore grows dim, and the past begins to fold itself back into the dark. Before we end tonight's story, remember this gentle truth. Even when the world forgets, the traces of every life remain somewhere. In the sea, in the air, in the stories we tell to each other in the quiet hours before sleep. You've been listening to one of those stories tonight. So take a deep breath. Let it out slowly. The waves still move, the fire still glows, and history, calm and patient, continues to whisper its secrets through the night. Sleep well, traveler of the past. The northern shores are at peace, and now, so are you. The sea is calm tonight. The tide glides over the stones with quiet intention, carrying the faint scent of pine and salt. In the distance, a single shape rests against the dim horizon, a longship, its bow worn smooth by years of travel. It stands alone now, tethered to a pier that has seen too many winters. The harbour is silent, but not empty. There is presence here, a soft, lingering memory that clings to the mist. This ship was not built for battle or conquest. It was built for farewell. The wood groans as the tide shifts beneath it, as though it remembers every journey it once took. There was a time when dozens of vessels like it lined these northern harbours, their sails white as the clouds above. But tonight, there is only one. A single vessel waiting to leave, quietly, into the unknown. Men once gathered here with purpose. The smell of tar, the chatter of sailors, the steady rhythm of oars against water. These were the sounds that defined a life beside the sea. But now, those sounds are gone. The air carries only the cry of distant gulls and the faint hum of wind between the masts. Even the ropes that once held fast have grown thin, frayed by salt and time. A small group stands nearby, wrapped in wool against the cold. Their faces are calm, resigned. They do not cheer or cry out. There is no ceremony, no banner waving in the wind. Just the slow pull of the tide and the steady creak of the old ship's frame. It is not a grand departure. It is simply what comes next, a quiet continuation of something too vast to end with noise. One man steps forward, his boot sinking slightly into the wet sand. He places his hand on the side of the ship, tracing the carvings worn faint by time. Once, those carvings told stories, journeys taken, storms survived, lands seen and remembered. Now, they are barely visible, fading like words whispered too often to the sea. He does not speak. There is nothing left to say. The ship, like the people who built it, understands that words are not always needed. Some goodbyes happen in silence, between the wind and the water, the tide and the shore. This is one of them. The oars are lifted, set gently into their places. The man steps aboard and feels the familiar sway beneath his feet. It is a motion that his ancestors would have known instantly. The steady balance between movement and stillness, between what is left behind and what lies ahead. The ship sighs softly, as if it, too, is ready to rest. The others push the vessel free. The hull scrapes once against the stones, then slides forward into open water. No shouts, no waves, just the sound of wood and sea meeting for what feels like the last time. The man at the oar rows slowly, carefully, until the shore begins to fade into mist. Behind him, the harbour watches in silence. The wooden docks, the empty barrels, the footprints in the sand, they all remain, small marks of a people who once reached beyond every horizon. But even these traces will soon vanish under snow and tide. The world, in its quiet way, is closing a chapter. Far from shore, the Longship glides over calm water. The air is sharp and cold, the kind that bites softly at the skin and keeps the mind clear. The man looks up, no stars yet, only a wide grey sky that seems endless. The sound of each oar stroke echoes through the open space, steady and slow, as if marking time itself. He does not know exactly where he is going. Perhaps it does not matter. The journey is the memory, and the act of leaving is its own kind of story. For every culture, there comes a moment when the old ways must drift into legend. Tonight is that moment for the North. Back at the harbour, the tide begins to rise. Water fills the shallow grooves left by the ship's keel. Within hours, there will be no sign it was ever there. The sea smooths everything it touches. It has always done so, not to erase, but to preserve gently, under the surface, where memory sleeps. If you listen carefully, you might hear the rhythm of the oars in your mind, that soft, patient sound, repeating with the calm of a heartbeat. It is the same rhythm that carried the first explorers, the same rhythm that now carries the last one away. Some sounds never really vanish. They simply grow quieter, waiting for the right ear to listen again. As the ship drifts farther, the mist thickens. The land is gone from view now, hidden behind the pale curtain of evening. The man rows a little slower, not from fatigue, but from reflection. Each pull of the oar feels like turning a page, closing a story that once filled the world with noise and fire, and now ends with water and silence. The horizon stretches endlessly before him. There is peace in that emptiness, the kind that humbles the heart and quiets the mind. Somewhere ahead, the sea meets the sky, and the last longship glides into it, leaving nothing behind but stillness. The sea deepens to a darker shade of blue, the kind that feels endless. The man rows quietly, his breath steady, his movements practiced. The air is still except for the rhythmic splash of the oars. Each sound fades almost as soon as it's made, absorbed into the vastness around him. There is no destination now, only the act of going, the movement itself becoming the meaning. Far behind him, the coastline dissolves into memory. The hills and pines fade into mist, until even their shapes are gone. The world that raised him, that once buzzed with life and trade and song, is nothing but a faint outline against the horizon. Yet he feels no sorrow, only acceptance. Time takes everything, gently, and turns it into peace. A soft wind begins to rise. It catches the edge of his cloak, carries the faint scent of pine and salt. He lifts his eyes toward the open water, where the sea glimmers like liquid glass. Somewhere beneath that calm surface lie the bones of other ships, the echoes of countless journeys. He wonders how many ended here, at the quiet edge of the world. The longship moves without hurry, its wooden ribs groan softly, as though exhaling after centuries of service. The man listens to the sound, not with sadness, but with gratitude. This vessel carried his people across oceans and through storms, guided by the knowledge that every tide eventually finds its rest. In that moment, the sky shifts. The first stars appear, trembling faintly above the water. The air feels colder now, the kind of cold that sharpens memory. He slows his rowing and simply drifts, letting the sea decide his pace. The stillness feels alive, as though the world itself is breathing alongside him. He looks toward the northern lights beginning to shimmer in the distance. Their green and silver ribbons stretch across the heavens, faint but graceful. He remembers how elders used to describe them, not as omens or signs, but as the dance of the cold air meeting the warm breath of the earth. A meeting of elements, guided by the will of the Almighty, who gives beauty even to the loneliest of nights. The lights move slowly, and he watches them in silence. The oars rest at his sides, floating gently on the water. Time stretches thin, like the horizon itself. There's no rush to reach anything, no need to arrive. The journey, he realizes, was always about learning to be still. In the distance, a single bird crosses the fading sky, its wings catching the last light. It circles once, then disappears toward land. The man smiles faintly. Even the creatures of the air seem to know when to return home. But for him, home has already become something different. Not a place, but a quietness within. The sea grows darker. The stars above burn a little brighter. The longship, once a tool of might and discovery, has become a cradle for memory. Every plank, every rope, every mark of age tells a story of endurance. There is beauty in that, the kind that doesn't demand to be seen, only to be felt. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the rhythm of the waves syncing with your own breathing. The ship sways gently, side to side, like a cradle rocking on the water. each motion a whisper, each whisper a reminder that even endings can be calm. Hours pass unnoticed. The sea and sky have become the same color now, a deep shade of stillness. The man leans back against the hull, his eyes half closed. He thinks of the people on the shore, of the harbor lights fading behind him, of all the lives that once shared his rhythm. Everything has quieted, but nothing feels lost. There is peace in the forgetting. The kind of peace that comes when one finally releases what must be let go. History, after all, doesn't vanish. It simply changes shape, carried onward by those who still breathe and dream. As the night deepens, the Longship drifts farther, disappearing into the mist. The sound of the oars is gone now, replaced by the soft hush of the sea. The stars shimmer faintly above, guiding the vessel like gentle eyes watching from afar. The world below remains calm, undisturbed. And somewhere, back on the northern shore, the tide reaches its highest point and begins to fall again. The water smooths over the marks left by the ship's departure, leaving the sand untouched. The sea, patient and vast, takes the memory for safekeeping, not to hide it, but to hold it in stillness, where time cannot harm it. The last Longship has left the harbor. The night is quiet once more. The world exhales, and the story settles, not with a final word, but with silence. The kind of silence that soothes, that comforts, that reminds us everything passes in its own gentle way. And in that quiet, the North sleeps. When the journeys ended, the sea finally grew quiet. The people of the North, once restless, bold, and driven by wind, turned their gaze inward, toward the land. The sound of oars gave way to the rustle of wheat. The clang of iron became the soft hum of tools made for harvest, not battle. Where shields once hung proudly, dried herbs now dangled from the beams of wooden cottages. The world had changed, but it was not loss that filled the air. It was relief, the long exhale of a people learning to live in peace with what remained. The same hands that once gripped swords now pressed seeds into the soil. And in that quiet exchange, something deeper began to grow. The men who once sailed toward danger found themselves waking before dawn to tend to fields. The morning frost bit at their fingers, and the sound of roosters replaced the rhythm of war drums. They still carried strength, but it was no longer used to fight. It was used to build, to repair, to provide. Across the valleys, the smell of bread replaced the smoke of fire. Their villages, once outposts of warriors, became places of steady labor and patient care. And though the wind still sang of the sea, fewer turned to listen. The rhythm of the land had claimed them. Each season brought its own kind of challenge. Storms still came, but now they tested patience instead of courage. Long winters reminded them that life was fragile, that warmth must be shared and work done together. The old skills of navigation were replaced by a new kind of wisdom. Reading clouds, knowing when to plant, when to wait, when to rest. They had traded maps of the ocean for the quiet certainty of seasons. And in that trade, they found something many of them had never known before: contentment. Sometimes, around the fires at night, they still spoke of their ancestors, the voyagers, the explorers, the ones who followed the stars across endless waves. But their voices carried no longing, only gratitude. They knew that every storm survived had led them here, to stillness, to family, to the rhythm of a quieter life. History, like the tide, had turned. And with it, they found peace in simplicity. The tools of war had not vanished completely. They rested in corners, covered in dust. Blades once meant for defense now served to clear brush or carve wood. The same precision that once shaped weapons now shaped plows and beams. There was dignity in that transformation, a reminder that strength does not disappear when conflict ends. It changes purpose, becoming the silent foundation of something gentler. Children grew up hearing fewer tales of conquest and more about endurance. They learned that the greatest battles were fought not with iron, but with patience, surviving hunger, protecting the harvest, keeping the hearth warm through long winters. Their stories were smaller, but no less meaningful. Where once they spoke of kings and captains, now they spoke of neighbors, of families, of shared bread. If you close your eyes, you can almost see it, the smoke rising from small homes, the laughter of children chasing geese through muddy fields, the low hum of a lullaby sung to the rhythm of the fire. Life had slowed, but it had deepened. Every meal, every day survived, was a quiet victory. The land became their teacher, their keeper, their comfort. And though some still felt the pull of the sea, it no longer called them as it once did. They had seen what waited beyond the horizon, endless water, endless struggle, and found more meaning in watching the sunrise over their own roofs. The sea had taught them to endure, the land taught them to belong. Each morning began the same way, the creak of a door, the crunch of frost underfoot, the smell of smoke curling into the pale air. The simplicity of routine became a kind of prayer, not spoken, but lived. The rhythm of tending to the earth became the rhythm of gratitude itself. They no longer sought glory, because survival, in its quiet way, was enough. Old warriors aged gracefully. Their broad shoulders carried the weight of harvests instead of armor. Their eyes softened, though the sharpness of memory still flickered within. Sometimes, as they sat near the hearth, the glow of the fire reminded them of distant sunsets at sea. But when they turned away, they saw their children sleeping safely, and they smiled. It was enough to have built a life where peace could grow. The long winters became times of storytelling and patience. When snow blanketed the earth, families gathered closer. The sound of wind outside was no longer a warning, only part of the song of the north. The fire burned low, and in that flickering light, they found warmth not from conquest, but from company. In those nights, the rhythm of the past met the rhythm of the present. The pulse of the sea became the heartbeat of the home. Even the silence carried history, a reminder of what had been, and of what was now preserved in peace. The transformation from warriors to farmers was not loss, but evolution, a return to balance after centuries of motion. And yet, deep within the oldest among them, there lingered a strange nostalgia. Not for war, but for purpose. The kind of purpose that once filled the sails with wind and the heart with fire. But they found new purpose in smaller acts, teaching a son how to hold a plow, guiding a daughter through the rhythms of planting and harvest. The legacy of strength remained, only quieter now, wrapped in gentleness. There were still days when the wind shifted from the sea and carried the faint scent of salt. On those days, the people looked toward the horizon with calm eyes. They no longer wondered what lay beyond. They had learned that every adventure ends somewhere, and sometimes the greatest journey is learning how to stay. By the time spring returned, the fields shimmered with new life. The Longship harbors had turned to meadows, and the sound of hammers had been replaced by the songs of birds. The old ways had not been erased. They had simply become roots beneath the soil, feeding a quieter, more enduring world. And as the wind moved through the grass, it carried with it the soft echo of oars long gone, not as ghosts, but as memories that had finally found rest. The sea, though distant now, never truly left their lives. Its rhythm still lived in the way they worked, in the swing of the axe, in the pull of the plow, in the patience of waiting for rain. It was as if the ocean had followed them inland, reshaping itself into the slow tide of the seasons. The same courage that once braved storms now faced the quiet trials of survival. They had traded thunder for silence, yet found a strange beauty in that exchange. In every village, old songs remained, though their meanings had changed. What were once chants for victory became lullabies for children. What were once stories of danger became lessons in patience. The sound of the old language, softened by time, carried warmth instead of warning. The people did not erase their past, they simply spoke it more gently. There were still moments when memories of the sea stirred in their hearts, the crash of waves, the spray of salt on their faces, the rush of open water. But those memories were no longer wounds or desires. They became like dreams, brief, beautiful, and harmless. When they woke each morning, the land was enough. The tools of farming grew familiar in their hands. Every groove in the wood, every dull edge of a blade held the mark of daily devotion. These tools were extensions of the body, just as the sword and oar once were. But now, each motion was an act of creation rather than destruction. They had discovered that to nurture the earth was also to heal themselves. Children born in this quieter age could not imagine their ancestors' restless voyages. Their world felt smaller, but safer. They learned early that strength could be silent, that courage was not only in facing the unknown, but also in tending to what is already known. The new generation grew strong not from conquest, but from care. As years passed, the boundaries between land and sea blurred. The fishermen still ventured out, but never far. The horizon became less of a challenge and more of a companion, a distant line reminding them that the world was vast, yet their small corner was enough. They learned to find wonder not in distance, but in detail, the gleam of frost on a window, the call of a bird returning with spring. The long winters no longer frightened them. They had learned how to prepare, storing grain, sharing warmth, reading the sky for signs of snow. Hardship was no longer a test, but a teacher, and in its lessons, they found unity. When storms came, they endured together. When spring returned, they rejoiced together. Life became a shared rhythm, steady, unhurried, complete. At night, by the fire's glow, stories continued. But now they were softer, simpler. No one spoke of kings or empires. They spoke of kindness, a neighbor who shared food, a mother who nursed through fever, a father who kept the lantern burning through the long dark. In these small acts, the greatness of the North survived. Old warriors, now grey and bent, sometimes gazed toward the sky with quiet reflection. They knew that their battles had shaped this peace. The firelight flickered against their faces, and in that light, they looked content. What they had once sought across oceans had been here all along, the steady, sacred calm of ordinary days. The forests around their villages grew thick again. Nature reclaimed what had been taken, and in return, gave back life. The rivers ran clear, the soil grew rich, and the air felt lighter. They understood that this balance was a blessing, that the world, in its mercy, always renews what people choose to respect. Sometimes, in the first light of dawn, a soft mist would rise from the fields, rolling over the earth like the breath of the sea. In those moments, it felt as if the old world and the new had merged, the echo of the waves hidden inside the heartbeat of the land. History had not ended. It had simply changed its form. And as the seasons turned, children who once played among the wheat grew into adults who carried that rhythm forward. They no longer remembered the taste of salt on their lips, but they knew the feel of soil between their fingers. They no longer sought to be remembered, but to continue, quietly, faithfully, as their ancestors once did. Each year, fewer spoke of the sea. Its stories became like old dreams, treasured but distant. What remained was life itself, unfolding in slow circles. The people of the North had learned that peace was not something to be found, but something to be grown. It required time, patience, and the courage to stay. By the time the oldest among them closed their eyes for the last time, they did so without regret. The sound of waves, once a call to adventure, had become a lullaby, gentle, forgiving, eternal in its motion. The North, once fierce and wild, had found its stillness. And in that stillness, the story of the Vikings quietly became the story of home. The world outside might forget their names, but the land remembered. Every field, every stone wall, every grain of sand along the fjord carried their touch. They were no longer warriors of the sea, but keepers of the earth, steady, humble, and at peace. And in that peace, history rested, finally, in warmth. The harbours of the North had once been alive with noise, hammers striking wood, ropes creaking, laughter echoing across the water. But time, slow and unbending, turned those sounds into whispers. Now, the docks stand empty. The tide laps softly against stone walls that lean with age. Moss creeps between the cracks where feet once hurried to meet arriving ships. The air carries only the faint scent of salt and pine. What was once a gate to the world has become a quiet mirror for the sky. At dawn, the mist rolls in from the sea, curling around the broken posts like soft fabric. The water is calm, smooth enough to reflect the pale light of the sun. Birds rest on the edges of old wooden beams, pecking at seaweed and watching the empty horizon. The harbour has become their home now, a sanctuary for stillness. No sails break the skyline. No shouts of greeting or farewell disturb the quiet. Only the sea remains faithful, moving as it always has. If you walk here in your mind, you can almost feel it beneath your feet, the worn wood, the faint vibration of the tide below. Each plank carries a story, though the people who live them are long gone. There's a heaviness in the silence, but also comfort. The harbour doesn't grieve what it's lost. It simply holds what remains. History has weight, and here it feels gentle. Along the shore, the remains of warehouses and small cottages stand half-sunken into the ground. Their roofs sag under moss, their windows filled with dust. Yet even in ruin, there's beauty. The wood glows golden when sunlight hits it. The air inside still smells faintly of tar and salt. Nature hasn't destroyed the harbour. It has adopted it, wrapping every beam and rope in quiet patience. Sometimes, when the wind blows from the west, it carries faint echoes, the low groan of a ship's hull, the far-off ring of iron against iron. Of course, they're only tricks of the breeze, but for a moment, the harbour feels alive again. The sound fades as quickly as it comes, leaving behind only the steady rhythm of the water. It's as if the past itself breathes here, softly, between the spaces of silence. In the evenings, the light turns amber. The shadows grow long across the docks, and the surface of the sea glimmers like molten glass. It's a beautiful kind of loneliness, the kind that soothes rather than saddens. The harbour does not need to be filled to have meaning. Its emptiness tells its own story. A single lantern still hangs by one of the old posts, its glass cracked and clouded by salt. It hasn't been lit in years, but when the sunset catches it just right, the glass glows as though it still remembers the fire it once held. The harbour, in its silence, reflects the quiet endurance of all things that once mattered deeply and still matter quietly. When night falls, the stars appear above the water. Their light trembles across the tide, and for a moment, it feels as though the heavens are reflected perfectly in the sea. The harbours of the north were built for journeys, but now they serve a different purpose, to remind us that even what no longer moves can still hold beauty. The old ropes, half buried in sand, have turned brittle. They crumble when touched, but their shapes remain, curled and still, like memories frozen in time. Each one once held a ship steady, a bond between land and sea. Now, they rest quietly, no longer needing to hold anything but air. In the quiet hours before dawn, fog covers everything. The world becomes soft and indistinct. The line between water and sky disappears, and it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. It's in this hour that the harbour feels most alive, not because it moves, but because it listens. The stillness here isn't empty. It's filled with memory. The people who live nearby rarely come here now. They pass along the cliffs or follow inland paths. The harbour belongs to time itself. Its silence feels sacred, the kind that doesn't ask to be broken. When the wind moves, it hums through the hollows of the old beams, a song too low for words, too deep for meaning, yet somehow familiar. Sometimes, the moonlight falls perfectly on the water, casting silver paths that stretch far into the distance. You can almost imagine a ship gliding down that path, its oars dipping in slow rhythm, carrying voices long vanished. The image lasts only a moment, then fades back into the calm. The harbour exhales, and all is still again. Every now and then, a traveller wanders here, drawn by curiosity, by stories passed down from older generations. They step lightly, as though afraid to disturb something sacred. And in the silence, they understand. The harbour doesn't need words or monuments. It speaks through absence, a language only patience can hear. If you listen carefully, you can hear more than water and wind. You can hear the rhythm of time itself, slow, steady, indifferent. The harbour has outlived its builders, its ships, its purpose. But in that endurance lies a quiet strength. It doesn't cling to the past. It simply remains, allowing the sea to write and rewrite its story each day. And as you picture it now, the mist, the creaking beams, the still reflection of stars, perhaps you can feel the same calm that fills this place. The harbour is no longer a passage to the world. It is a resting point for the soul. It teaches by silence, by stillness, by the acceptance that every journey, no matter how grand, must someday come home to quiet. By morning, the mist begins to lift, and the sea returns to its steady rhythm. The tide draws away from the shore, leaving patterns of shells and driftwood in its wake. Each tide reshapes the harbor slightly, as if time itself is still carving its story into the land. What once was a place of noise and ambition has become a lesson in patience, that even what fades can remain meaningful. The silence doesn't erase the past, it preserves it. The sun rises slowly, spilling pale light across the empty docks. The broken posts cast long shadows that sway gently with the water. It's a simple beauty, honest and fragile. The same light that once guided sailors now falls on wildflowers growing between stones. What was built for departure has become a garden for stillness. The harbor has changed its purpose without complaint, letting time decide what should stay and what should go. In some corners, the sea has begun to reclaim what humans left behind. The water seeps into the gaps between stones, carrying salt and life in equal measure. Small crabs crawl where once barrels of goods were rolled. Seagrass waves gently from beneath the surface. The harbor is returning to its first form, not a place of travel, but part of the ocean itself. It's not decay, it's restoration. There is a peace in seeing the world repair itself. The same hands that once fought against nature now seem to have surrendered to it. The wooden docks bend, the iron rusts, and the wind hums through hollow beams. Yet, somehow, it all feels right. The harbor breathes again, in a quieter, older rhythm. What remains is balance, not between people and the sea, but between memory and forgetting. At dusk, when the sky burns softly with color, the water reflects it perfectly. The harbor looks alive again for a brief moment, glowing with the golden rose of fading daylight. The air feels warmer, though the temperature hasn't changed. It's the kind of warmth that comes from remembering something beautiful without needing to hold on to it. The day gives way to evening, and the silence grows gentle once more. Now and then, a fisherman rows past, his small boat cutting softly through the water. He does not stop. He doesn't need to. He knows the harbor's silence is sacred, and his presence would only disturb its sleep. He rows quietly, eyes forward, letting the wind carry him past the ghosts of masts and sails that no longer stand. The sea accepts him as it accepted them, without judgment, without question. When night returns, the moonlight spreads across the tide like silver cloth. The old harbor glows faintly, each ripple catching a thread of light. The sound of the sea becomes slower, deeper. It feels as though the ocean itself has fallen into a dream. You can almost hear its breathing, slow, patient, endless. It's easy to imagine the people who once stood here, waiting for ships to come home. The wives, the sons, the old men by the piers, all long gone, their stories absorbed by the wind. Yet somehow, their presence lingers. The harbor remembers not through words, but through the way it holds still when the waves arrive, as if pausing to listen for voices that never return. In the quiet, even the smallest sound feels important. The soft lap of water against stone, the cry of a lone bird overhead, the faint rustle of reeds along the shore. Each sound adds to the harbor song, a melody built not from music, but from the patience of existence. The world moves quickly beyond these shores, but here, everything slows until time itself feels kind. Some travelers say that standing in such silence makes them uneasy. They expect something to happen, a boat to appear, a sound to break the stillness. But nothing does. And slowly, unease turns to calm. The silence teaches them what the old sailors once knew, that not every journey is meant to be loud, and not every ending must be filled with words. In this stillness, you might notice your own thoughts begin to soften, like sand settling after a wave. The harbor's quiet rhythm becomes your own. It doesn't demand attention. It simply invites you to rest beside it. The sea doesn't mourn its lost ships, and neither should we mourn the passage of time. Everything that drifts away leaves behind a shape of peace. Somewhere beneath the dark water lie fragments of wood, nails, bits of rope. They sleep there now, undisturbed. The sea keeps them safely, the way a parent keeps old letters, not to read, but to remember that something once mattered deeply. In this way, the harbour has never truly lost anything. It has simply learned how to keep memory without clinging. The stars above begin to gather again, reflected perfectly on the still water. It looks as though the sky itself has descended, resting for a moment on the earth. The harbour becomes a mirror for creation, quiet, vast, full of meaning. In this reflection, the old world meets the new, and both rest together in the calm of night. As the tide rises one last time before dawn, the sound deepens, surrounding the harbour with a gentle hush. The water touches the worn stones, then slips away, again and again, as if whispering a promise to return. This is how history continues, not through noise or memory, but through the patient repetition of life itself. And when you picture it now, the moon above, the tide below, the silence between, let yourself rest there. The harbour doesn't need movement to have purpose. It simply exists, quietly faithful to time, to change, and to the peace that comes after. The world may have forgotten the Vikings, but their harbours remain, not as ruins, but as sanctuaries of stillness, where history sleeps and the sea keeps watch. Far from the silent harbours, tucked between forests and frost-covered hills, small villages still breathed with life. Smoke curled gently from low chimneys, carrying the scent of pine and burning peat. Chickens scratched in the snow-dusted yards, and the steady rhythm of chopping would echoed faintly through the morning air. These were not places of conquest or glory anymore. They were places of memory. The sea might have forgotten the old songs, but the people here still whispered them, softly, to the fire. Each village had its storyteller, an elder with hands rough from work and a voice shaped by wind and age. In the long evenings, after the tools were set aside, the people would gather around the warmth of a single hearth. The glow of the flames painted gentle light on tired faces. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but inside there was calm, the kind of calm that made stories bloom like spring after winter. The tales were no longer about battles or faraway lands. They were about storms survived, about courage found in hunger and cold. Sometimes, the elder would speak of a great-grandfather who had once seen a longship on the horizon, its sail white as snow before it vanished into mist. No one questioned whether the story was true. It didn't matter. The truth lived in the telling, not the facts. Children sat cross-legged near the fire, their eyes wide. For them, the old world was half dream, half echo. They imagined ships made of light, heroes who listened to the sea, and mountains that whispered names. Yet what they learned beneath those stories was simpler, that endurance, kindness, and faithfulness to one's home were worth more than all the oceans in the world. Outside the walls, snow began to fall, soft and slow. The flakes landed on the roofs and fences, muffling every sound. It was as if the world itself was listening. Even the wind seemed to pause when the elder spoke of the first settlers, of how they learned to read the seasons and walk in harmony with the land. These stories were no longer history lessons. They were lullabies for the soul. When dawn returned, the villagers rose quietly. Some went to mend fences, others to tend livestock. The world moved at the pace of breath, of necessity. No one hurried. No one looked toward the sea anymore. Their history was no longer something to chase. It was something to carry, like a song learned by heart. In every act of labor, a thread of the past remained. The old crafts still survived here. Women wove thick wool into cloth, tracing patterns that once decorated sails. Men carved wooden figures, not as idols, but as reminders, small symbols of courage, family, and endurance. These crafts were prayers made visible, expressions of gratitude to the Almighty for strength through simplicity. Nothing was wasted, and every detail meant something. When night returned, the same fire was lit again. The room filled with familiar warmth, and new stories were told, stories of the day just lived. How a child helped bring water from the stream, or how the first lamb was born in the cold. The grand tales of the past had faded, but in their place grew something more honest, the poetry of daily life. The storyteller often paused mid-sentence, letting silence hang between words. That silence was part of the story, too. It reminded everyone that memory doesn't always need to be spoken aloud. Some things live best in quiet hearts. The people had learned that remembering wasn't about repeating. It was about keeping the essence alive. Sometimes travelers from distant lands would pass through these villages, carrying news of the world beyond. They spoke of new empires, of cities built with stone and glass, of wonders unseen by the villagers. The people listened politely, smiling faintly. When the travelers left, they returned to their work as before. Their wonder was not in what was far away, but in what remained close: the trees, the earth, the steady light of the moon. Each home had something old tucked away: a piece of rope, a rusted nail, a small carving of a ship. These relics were not displayed with pride, but kept quietly in drawers and corners, like secret friendships with time. They didn't worship the past. They honored it gently, the way one honors an ancestor, with respect, not with longing. The younger ones, curious and bright, sometimes asked what the old world had been like. The elders smiled, stirring the fire before they answered. It was noisy, they would say, loud with ambition, full of motion. Then they'd look around the quiet room and add softly, "But peace lasts longer than noise." The children nodded, and though they didn't fully understand, they remembered those words. Even the animals seemed to move in rhythm with the calm. The dogs slept by the fire, the cattle breathed steam into the cold air, and the horses stood patiently in the stable, listening to the slow heartbeat of the world. Everything belonged, everything knew its place. The villagers didn't fight against the passage of time. They moved with it, step by step. When spring finally came, the snow melted into rivers that wound through the valleys. The sound of rushing water filled the air, and with it came renewal. The villagers gathered to clear the fields and repair the fences washed away by frost. As they worked, they sang old songs, not in full voice, but softly, almost to themselves. Their melodies weren't meant for celebration, but for gratitude. And in those songs, faint as they were, the memory of the Vikings still lived, not as warriors, but as ancestors who had once known the same wind, the same earth, the same patience. The villagers didn't keep history alive through monuments or written words. They kept it through living, through every gesture of care, every quiet act of endurance, every story told in the glow of firelight. As the years passed, the faces around the fires changed. The elders grew older, their voices softer, their pauses longer. New hands took up the work, and new hearts began to understand what the stories truly meant. The young ones no longer asked about the sea. They asked about the soil, the weather, and the quiet wisdom of patience. The sea had once shaped their ancestors' courage. Now the land shaped their peace. There was a rhythm to village life that never truly ended. The same doors opened each morning, the same paths filled with footprints each evening. The seasons marked time better than any clock. Spring carried the hum of renewal, summer sang with labor, autumn whispered of preparation, and winter taught stillness. This rhythm became a comfort, a lullaby made of weather and work, guiding each generation through the gentle passing of time. Every household carried its own small archive of memories. A worn comb carved from driftwood, a spindle once turned by a grandmother's hand, the faint engraving of a wave on a wooden bowl. These were not treasures of gold or fame, but reminders of endurance, of how much could be preserved without needing to be seen. The people didn't need grand monuments. Their history was in their touch, their voices, their way of living. On long evenings, when the sky glowed violet and blue, the villagers often stepped outside to watch the stars appear. The same constellations their ancestors once used for navigation now simply marked the hours of rest. The stars no longer led them to distant lands. They led them back home, reminding them that light still shines even when the world sleeps. The children listened to the wind and learned that silence, too, carries meaning. Sometimes they swore they could hear faint echoes, the sound of oars, the whisper of sails, but the elders only smiled. The sea remembers, they would say quietly, and the wind likes to tell its stories. It wasn't superstition. It was gratitude for being part of something vast and unbroken. When visitors came again, bringing tales of progress and power. The villagers welcomed them with food and warmth. They listened, nodded, and asked gentle questions. But when the guests left, the people felt no envy. They knew that speed and glory always come at the cost of peace, and they chose peace. Their contentment was quiet but deep, like a well that never runs dry. Sometimes, when snow covered the rooftops and the air shimmered with cold, the people gathered closer, grateful for every spark of heat. They didn't curse the winter, they respected it. It reminded them that comfort is a gift, not a guarantee. The fire burned low, and the light reflected in their eyes. In that glow, they saw the same endurance that had carried their ancestors across oceans. Aging faces still told the stories, but fewer words were needed now. The stories had become part of the landscape itself. Every tree, every stone, every winding path carried whispers of the old world. Even the rivers seemed to murmur the names of people long gone, their voices softened into music. When someone passed away, the villagers mourned quietly. They didn't speak of endings. They spoke of continuations, of roots deepening, of memories rippling outward. Death was not something to fear. It was part of the same rhythm that turns storms into calm, winters into springs. The Almighty had made balance in all things, and they saw it clearly here, in the stillness of their simple lives. In the rare moments when a storm swept through, rattling the shutters and bending the trees, no one panicked. They simply waited, trusting that the wind would move on, as it always had. And when it did, they stepped outside and found the world fresh and washed anew. Even destruction, they learned, could become renewal when seen with patience. The children who once listened by the fires grew into adults who no longer needed stories told aloud. They carried the lessons within them, the rhythm of endurance, the reverence for quiet, the gratitude for ordinary days. They had learned that peace is not found in forgetting the past, but in living gently beside it. On nights when the sky was especially clear, some of them still looked toward the sea, not with longing, but with a kind of love. The water glimmered faintly under the moon, stretching into the distance. It no longer represented adventure, but reflection, a mirror of their own calm hearts. The waves that once carried their ancestors away now carried their memories back again. The older villagers often said that history was like the tide. It goes, it returns, it changes shape, but it never truly disappears. That was enough for them. They didn't need to be remembered by the world, because they remembered themselves through the act of living kindly. In every shared meal, every gentle word, the essence of their people endured. And as another winter crept closer, the cycle began again. Fires lit, stories retold, bread baked. The same stars that once guided ships now guided sleep. The villagers rested, wrapped in snow and silence, held together by a faith deeper than words. Time had taken their empires, their harbors, their sails, but it had given them something greater, the peace of remembering without wanting to return. So the villagers remained, glowing softly in the dark northern night, small lights of memory against the vast, quiet world. And though the sea no longer called their names, the people still listened, smiling faintly at its eternal voice. For in that voice, they heard the same truth that had carried them through centuries, that nothing good is ever truly lost. It only changes form and waits to be remembered again, in the stillness of a calm evening, when the fire burns low and the world is ready to rest. In the quiet centuries that followed, fewer storytellers remained. The halls grew smaller, the gatherings fewer. Life no longer turned around the telling of tales, but around the needs of the soil, the family, the seasons. The sagas began to thin, like old cloth fraying at the edges. The names of heroes once spoken with pride were forgotten, their deeds left adrift in the fog of memory. The last storytellers were not poets or travelers. They were farmers, weavers, and elders whose voices cracked but still carried warmth. They spoke less for fame and more for comfort. On long winter nights, they would sit close to the fire and speak softly to the children, their words falling into the rhythm of the flames. The great epics had become small, gentle stories about kindness, patience, and endurance. Outside, the wind moved through the thatched roofs like a low whisper. It carried the ghosts of the old words, fragments of forgotten verses, half-remembered songs. Sometimes, it seemed as though the air itself was trying to remember what had once been said. But the people no longer needed grand stories of war or glory. They had found enough wonder in the stillness of their own lives. Every now and then, a traveler would arrive with scraps of memory, a fragment of a saga told in another village, a name carved into a piece of driftwood, a line of verse preserved in habit rather than understanding. The villagers would listen politely, smiling at the sound of words that felt both familiar and distant. They knew these were the voices of their ancestors, faint but still alive, carried by the mercy of time. In the evenings, when the sky burned with the last light of day, the villagers sometimes repeated the few verses they remembered. The words no longer carried the weight of history. They had become songs of gratitude. The rhythm had slowed, the edges softened. The sagas no longer spoke of conquest. They spoke of survival, of peace, of the Almighty's mercy through hardship. The great heroes of the past were remembered not for their power, but for their perseverance. Their names, if they were spoken at all, became metaphors for patience. The warriors had become symbols of those who endured hunger, loneliness, and cold. The old stories had been rewritten by life itself, reinterpreted through humility. In this new world, no one claimed to be a storyteller. The stories told themselves. The work of hands became part of the narrative, the steady shaping of wood, the planting of seeds, the mending of roofs. Life became its own kind of epic, written not in verse but in the language of patience and gratitude. Old books did exist, scattered in monasteries or private homes, but few could read them. The sagas that had once filled nights with music now lay silent, their letters fading in the dimness of forgotten corners. Yet even those unread pages carried a kind of holiness, proof that words once mattered enough to be preserved, even if their meanings were lost. When the first snows fell, the villagers gathered again around the fire. Someone might hum a tune, one that had no name, but carried the rhythm of the old days. The melody would float through the air, gentle and unhurried. And in that moment, the spirit of the sagas returned, not through memory, but through feeling. Outside, the frost glimmered under the moonlight. It looked almost like ink spilled across the earth, white, luminous, and fleeting. The world was quiet, and yet it spoke. Every whisper of the wind against the walls seemed to carry an unspoken truth, that stories do not die when they are forgotten. They rest, waiting to be lived again. In the distance, the sea sighed against the shore. The same rhythm that had once inspired poets now lulled children to sleep. The power of the sagas had always been in the cadence, the rise and fall of the storyteller's breath, the pauses between words, the way silence carried meaning. That rhythm lived on, long after the stories themselves were gone. And so, though no one recited the old epics anymore, the people still spoke in the same music. Their greetings, their farewells, their blessings over meals, all carried echoes of the sagas. The north had become quieter, yes, but not empty. The words had simply learned how to whisper. Perhaps that is how all stories end, not with forgetting, but with rest. The sagas did not vanish because no one cared. They vanished because their lessons had already been learned. The people no longer needed tales of how to survive. They were living proof of it. And in their quiet endurance, the spirit of every story remained, not in fame, but in peace. As generations passed, the memory of the sagas became something like a faint melody that no one could quite sing, yet everyone could hum. The words were gone, but the feeling remained, a quiet sense of belonging to something larger, something that had traveled through time to settle gently in their hearts. People no longer needed to know the verses to understand what they meant. They lived them every day, through patience, through kindness, through steady work beneath the turning sky. The wind still carried the echoes of old voices across the fjords. When it moved through the pine trees or brushed against the roofs, it almost sounded like a recitation, soft, broken, incomplete, yet filled with rhythm. It was as though the land itself had memorized what the people had forgotten. The Almighty allows memory to take many forms, and here it lived in sound, in the sigh of branches, the roll of waves, the heartbeat of the world. Books began to crumble. Pages faded. Ink ran like rain across parchment. The stories written to defy time succumbed to it, as all things do. But the loss was not tragic, it was natural. For as the words disappeared from the page, they appeared in life. The people had learned that what is lived with sincerity will always outlast what is written. The sagas had once been about men who braved storms, who sought distant lands and glory. But the new stories, the unwritten ones, were about those who stayed, who endured the storm of time itself. The women who spun wool through long winters, the men who built shelters from snow, the families who prayed quietly for another day of light. These were the new heroes, though no songs would ever bear their names. When travelers occasionally rediscovered a scrap of verse or a fragment of an ancient poem, they often felt awe, as if they had uncovered a secret. But for the people who had lived in the north for generations, it was no secret at all. They had never truly lost the sagas. They had simply stopped needing them to be spoken. They carried them in their manner, in their patience, in the quiet grace with which they faced the cold. At night, the stars over the north still told stories, though no one named them anymore. The constellations stretched across the sky like verses written in light. The villagers sometimes looked up and wondered if their ancestors once read the same patterns. It comforted them to think that what was once said aloud could now be seen, silent, but everlasting in meaning. The disappearance of the sagas did not mark the end of memory. It marked the beginning of peace. The people had found contentment in simplicity. They no longer needed to chase the past because they had become part of it, living echoes of those who came before, moving gently through the same wind, the same seasons, the same silence. When the old storytellers passed on, they did so quietly. There were no grand farewells, no laments. Their words had already been planted like seeds in the hearts of those who listened. And as those seeds took root, the need for words faded. The sagas had fulfilled their purpose, to teach, to remind, to prepare. What remained was the stillness of understanding. Years later, when the world outside began to change again, when ships returned, when new languages filled the air, the people of the north greeted it with calm. They listened, but they did not forget who they were. Their history no longer depended on story or song. It lived in the way they tended their homes, treated their neighbors, and trusted in the mercy of the Almighty who had carried them through both storm and silence. Even now, if you walk through those lands in your imagination, you might feel it, that gentle hum beneath the wind, the unspoken rhythm of a world that remembers by simply existing. The sagas are gone, but the spirit remains, not loud or proud, but patient, resting within the heartbeat of the north. And perhaps that is the final truth of all stories. They are not meant to last forever in words. They are meant to live long enough to shape hearts, to soften tempers, to remind people of what matters. Once that happens, silence is not loss, it is fulfillment. The tale has been told, and peace has taken its place. So when you hear the sound of wind through trees or the soft hiss of the sea against the rocks, remember, those are the sagas still speaking, not through voices, but through time itself. They no longer ask to be recited. They only ask to be felt. And in that quiet understanding, the North, and all its stories, continue to rest in calm. It did not happen suddenly, the day the world stopped saying their name. There was no decree, no decision, no moment of silence that marked the end. It simply faded, softly, like the final breath of a song that had been sung too many times. People still lived in the same valleys, walked along the same shores, and watched the same stars, but the stories had grown quiet. The word Viking drifted away from the tongue, not through rejection, but through forgetting. In the beginning, no one noticed. The elders spoke less of the old days, and the young listened less intently. The world around them had changed. New lands, new trades, new tongues. The stories of sails and storms no longer fit into their lives. The sea had become background noise, not destiny. Their hearts were anchored to the soil now, and their memories belonged to the fields rather than the waves. Over time, the old symbols faded. The carvings on doors, the patterns on cloth, the markings on stone, all softened under wind and rain. The meaning of those symbols slipped quietly out of memory. They became decoration, texture, something beautiful but unspoken. The The people who saw them no longer knew the stories behind them, yet still felt a strange comfort in their shapes, as if some quiet familiarity lingered beneath the surface. The few who still remembered said little. They did not correct the young when they used new words or told new tales. They had learned that memory cannot be forced to stay, it must be allowed to rest. And so they let the old name go. It did not vanish from bitterness, it simply grew tired, worn down by the slow rhythm of years. On the coasts where once ships had gathered, the wood of old piers had turned silver with salt. Seaweed clung to what remained, and gulls nested where once men had prepared to sail. The ocean still sang, but no one sang back. Its rhythm remained faithful, though fewer hearts beat to match it. It was not abandonment, only the quiet shifting of purpose. The songs of the sea were replaced by new melodies, the creak of wagons, the murmur of markets, the laughter of children in fields. These sounds were gentler, closer to the heart. They belonged to the rhythm of life that stayed still rather than the one that chased horizons. The people had learned to find meaning not in motion, but in remaining. When strangers passed through, they sometimes asked about the old ways. Who built these harbors? They wondered. Who carved these stones? The villagers shrugged and smiled politely. They didn't pretend to know. The answers had been carried away long ago, swept gently out to sea with the last of the old words. The strangers would move on, and the silence would settle again like dust after a breeze. There were no monuments raised, no statues or markers to remember them by. The people of the North had never built for remembrance. They had built for necessity. Their legacy was not made of stone, but of habits, quiet discipline, care for one another, endurance against the cold. These things needed no names to survive. They lived in the hands and hearts of those who came after. Sometimes, a wandering poet or scholar from another land would arrive, searching for the truth of the northern stories. They would look at the coastlines and villages, puzzled that no one spoke the name anymore. They wrote of what they saw, the emptiness, the quiet, the beauty without memory. But they misunderstood. What they called forgetting was not loss. It was acceptance. The name Viking had once carried power, adventure, fear, awe. But over the years, the people had grown beyond it. They no longer needed to be defined by what they had done. They were content with what they were. The title belonged to a time of motion and hunger. This was the age of calm. The same wind that once filled sails now moved through wheat fields instead. In the villages, children sometimes found strange old tools buried in the soil, bits of iron, fragments of carved wood, the corner of a rusted blade. They brought them home with curiosity. "What is this?" they asked. The elders would smile faintly and say, "Something from before." There was no sadness in their voices, only respect. The objects were not relics to worship, just reminders that the world keeps changing, as it must. The language itself shifted, as languages always do. Words softened, meanings merged. The sound of the old name no longer fit on the tongue. It was as though time had polished it smooth, leaving behind something quieter, simpler. The new words were gentler, more suited to the rhythm of peace. The people didn't mourn the change. They spoke as they lived, slowly, thoughtfully, with room for silence. On cold evenings, when the wind rattled the doors and the fire burned low, the villagers sometimes wondered how their ancestors had lived. They imagined the ships, the journeys, the endless horizon. But those thoughts came and went like passing clouds. Their lives were full enough with what was near: family, warmth, the sound of wind in the trees. Remembering was not their duty. Living well was. If someone mentioned the old name by chance, it was spoken softly, almost uncertainly. The sound felt foreign, as if it belonged to another world. A moment of silence followed, not from reverence but from unfamiliarity. Then someone would smile, pour another cup of warm drink, and the conversation would drift to gentler things: the coming harvest, the weather, the safety of the children asleep nearby. And so, without intention, the name that once carried across oceans disappeared from daily speech. It wasn't erased, it was simply no longer needed. The people who had once defined the waves had found peace on land. Their memory was not gone. It had just gone quiet, folded neatly into the rhythm of life. In that quiet, there was no sadness, no tragedy, only calm. The world had moved on, and the people had moved with it. They no longer needed the sound of the past to remind them of who they were. They had become the proof of their own history, living gently, enduring softly, holding their heritage not in words, but in the steady pulse of their hearts. Seasons passed as they always did: snow, thaw, bloom, harvest. The same sun that once shone on restless travelers now rose over quiet fields. The rhythm of life no longer followed the tide, but the turn of the earth itself. And though no one spoke the old name anymore, its presence lingered like a soft echo in the landscape, in the way people built their homes sturdy against storms, in the way they faced hardship with calm resolve. Memory had become action, not story. In small corners of the coast, the sea still whispered against the rocks. It never forgot its old companions, though they no longer came. The waves spoke in the same gentle rhythm they always had, but there were no sails to answer, no oars to disturb their pattern. The people inland might not have noticed, but the sea did. It kept speaking anyway, not for remembrance, but for continuity. One evening, an old man stood by the shore, his hair white, his hands folded behind his back. He had never sailed beyond the fjord, but he felt something familiar in the wind, a kind of recognition, though he could not name it. The smell of salt, the sound of water against stone, they stirred something deep, something that had no words. He smiled faintly, knowing that he was part of a story even if he could no longer tell it. The world around them had grown larger. New names filled the maps, new cities rose, new voices claimed the songs of history. But the people of the north did not compete with them. They had no need to. Their measure of life was not in fame or record, but in peace and endurance. They were not forgotten because they failed to matter. They were forgotten because they no longer needed to be remembered. Children grew up unaware that they walked the same paths once taken by explorers. They saw the sea as a boundary, not a beginning. When they looked at the horizon, they did not dream of crossing it. They dreamed of seasons ahead, of good weather, of enough food for winter. The horizon had become a symbol of stability rather than adventure. That was the greatest change of all. Sometimes, when the wind shifted just right, a faint pattern appeared on the water, like ripples shaped by invisible oars. Fishermen noticed but said nothing. They had learned that not every mystery needs to be named. Some things are best left as gifts of the moment, quiet and fleeting. The sea, after all, holds more stories than any man could tell. In the villages, the younger ones began to forget that the carvings on the oldest buildings even meant anything. The figures of ships, of waves, of faces staring toward the horizon, they became mere decorations. The elders, those few who still recognized their meaning, chose not to explain. Letting silence take over was a way of kindness. It allowed the past to rest, like a weary traveler finally given a bed. Over the years, the forests grew thicker around the coasts. Trees stood where ships had once been built. Their roots wrapped around the remains of old timbers, their trunks rising high into the mist. Nature had taken back what was hers, covering the marks of human ambition with moss and shade. But even as the forest reclaimed the shore, it did so gently, not as an act of erasure, but of forgiveness. When travelers from faraway lands rediscovered the north centuries later, they found only whispers of what had been, strange patterns in the soil, fragments of iron, faint traces of language in local speech. They asked questions, eager for stories, but the people only shrugged. They did not speak of what was gone. To them, it had become part of the landscape, like the stones or the sea. The travelers left with notes and sketches, promising to preserve what they had learned. But what they wrote were not the lives the villagers had lived, only their own interpretations. The truth of the old world was quieter than any book could capture. It did not need to be told. It simply existed, woven into the rhythm of wind and work. As years stretched on, the name Viking began to appear in writings again, stuttered and spoken by those far removed from its meaning. But here, in the north, no one used it. To the people who lived among the same winds and waters, it was only a sound, a word without weight. The stories belonged to the past, and the past had found its rest. When winter came again, snow covered everything in white silence. The world looked clean, unburdened. Fires burned inside homes, children laughed, and the soft glow of lamps turned the darkness warm. The people no longer thought of ancestors or heroes. They thought of one another, of food, of warmth, of surviving the long night together. That was enough. In this way, the forgetting was not a tragedy, but a mercy. To let go of names and stories was to make space for stillness, for life to move gently forward without the weight of what came before. The world had not abandoned its past. It had learned to live alongside it, quietly, peacefully, without need for repetition. And though no one spoke their name anymore, the North still carried their rhythm, in the way the sea breathed, in the way the people endured, in the way the wind whispered through the trees at dusk. The story continued, not in sound, but in silence. It was not gone. It was simply resting in the world that had once given it voice. When people vanish from memory, they rarely disappear entirely. Something always remains, not the noise of their names, but the quiet trace of their touch. In the North, where wind and water shaped everything, what the Vikings left behind was not a monument or a crown. It was a rhythm, a way of being. Their mark was not carved into stone, but woven into how people lived, how they endured, and how they moved with patience through the seasons. You could see it in the way homes were built, strong, simple, leaning slightly with the wind but never breaking. The walls held warmth the way hearts held memory, without needing to boast. The same methods that once crafted ships now built roofs to shelter families. Each beam, each joint, carried lessons passed silently through generations. Their skill had turned from conquering the world to protecting it, and in that transformation, something lasting was born. The old paths that once led to harbors still wound through the countryside, though they ended now in meadows or forests instead of the sea. Travelers still walk them, unaware that their footsteps followed the same routes used by sailors long ago. The trails had forgotten their purpose, but not their direction. They were the veins of memory, guiding people forward without needing to explain where they came from. Words, too, carried traces. Everyday speech still held pieces of the old language, small fragments of sound that had survived centuries of change. The people no longer knew their origin, but they spoke them naturally, as though the past had chosen to remain in their mouths. Language, like wind, carries what it must without asking permission. In villages, the old ways of crafting still persisted. The shapes of tools, the patterns of weaving, the curved lines of wooden handles, all echoed something ancient. No one called it tradition anymore. It was simply the right way to do things. The efficiency, the balance, the respect for natural form, these were not inherited through words, but through instinct. The hands remembered what the mind no longer did. Even their songs, though new in verse, carried the same cadence as before. The rhythm of rowing had become the rhythm of working, the beat of hammers replaced by the hum of daily labor. The melodies were slower now, but you could feel the same pulse beneath them, steady, resilient, shaped by generations who had learned that beauty does not always need volume. Along the coastlines, ruins still slept under moss and grass. What was once a trading post was now a hill. What had been a watchtower was now a mound where sheep grazed. Nature had softened everything, but not erased it. The Almighty allows the world to heal in this way, turning what was loud into something quiet, what was restless into something at peace. The remains were not lost. They had simply changed form. Somewhere, in an attic or barn, an old chest still held a few relics, a rusted buckle, a piece of jewelry, a coin blackened with age. They were not valuable to collectors, but they mattered to those who kept them. When touched, they carried a faint warmth, as though the memory of human hands had never quite faded. These objects did not speak of power or conquest. They spoke of work, of care, of ordinary lives lived with purpose. The greatest thing they left behind, though, was not a thing at all. It was endurance. The quiet ability to face cold mornings, to build with patience, to find comfort in simplicity. This was the legacy that lived beyond time, not eternal, but renewable, passed from one life to another like the steady flame of a hearth. Each generation tended it carefully, not to glorify the past, but to keep the warmth of life itself alive. When scholars centuries later studied the traces of the North, they wrote about ships and raids and kings. But they missed what mattered most, the transformation. The journey from noise to quiet, from battle to bread, from wandering to home. The people who remained had not vanished. They had evolved into something gentler, wiser. What they left behind was not empire, but harmony. Even the animals carried their memory. The sturdy horses, the calm dogs, the patient oxen, all were shaped by generations of partnership. The same spirit that once pulled ships through stormy seas now pulled plows through frozen soil. It was strength made humble. It was power that had learned compassion. In the colder months, when the night stretched long and deep, the villages glowed faintly in the dark, tiny clusters of warmth scattered across the land. Each home, each light, was a small continuation of the story. The people might not have known their ancestors by name, but they honored them by living kindly, by tending to their families, by facing each day without complaint. The architecture of their hearts had changed too. The desire for conquest had softened into gratitude. The hunger for more had turned into appreciation for enough. The world no longer needed their ships. It needed their steadiness. They had learned to listen more than they spoke, to repair more than they built anew, to let the wind teach them patience. Those who visited the North in later times often described the people as quiet, reserved, and strong. They saw only the surface, unaware that what they witnessed was centuries of refinement, the settling of a spirit once wild into one of calm. The storms of history had passed through them, leaving behind people who no longer reached for greatness, but for goodness. And if you stand on those same shores in your imagination, you might feel it, that faint trace in the air, that peace built from endurance. The ships are gone, the songs are forgotten, the names no longer spoken. Yet the essence remains in every small act of care, in every beam of wood laid with steady hands. What they left behind was not a world to conquer, but a world that knows how to endure with grace. When the spring sun returned and melted the last of the frost, the earth revealed its quiet treasures. Beneath the fields where crops grew, traces of the old world slept, broken pottery, bits of iron, the faint outline of a forgotten foundation. The people tilled their land without ceremony, pausing sometimes when a fragment surfaced, brushing the dirt away with gentle curiosity. They didn't see relics. They saw reminders that life always builds upon life, layer by patient layer. Some objects were passed from hand to hand, not to be studied, but to be held. The weight of them carried something more than metal or clay. It was a connection, silent and humble, between those who had come before and those still walking the earth. There was no need for stories or explanation. The understanding came naturally. Everything that had been once mattered, and still did, quietly, without needing to be spoken. In the fields, the plows still followed the same lines carved centuries ago. The land itself remembered the pattern of human hands, the rhythm of care. The boundaries between ancient and new had long dissolved. Each act of work became an echo of what had been, carried forward not through memory but through practice, the repetition of goodness, the steady faith in small things done well. The coastline, too, carried remnants of their presence. The curve of a cove shaped by once busy docks, the faint remains of a pier now hidden beneath seaweed, the pattern of stones that once guided travelers through fog. These details, unnoticed by many, formed a quiet map of endurance. The Almighty had allowed the sea to soften their marks but not to erase them completely, as if mercy itself wanted to keep a trace of those who once moved with such courage across his waters. In language, in craftsmanship, in the way they faced the world, that was their true inheritance. The words may have changed, but their cadence carried the same strength. The tools may have evolved, but their designs still held balance and grace. The hearts may have grown quieter, but their patience carried the same power that once propelled ships through storm and spray. Even the silence they left behind had its own meaning. The absence of noise, of conquest, of grand declarations, it spoke of maturity, of peace. It reminded those who came after that greatness is not always loud. Sometimes It is found in the smallest of gestures, the way one mends what is broken, the way one endures hardship without complaint, the way one lives gently in the world. As the centuries passed, their name might have disappeared, but their way remained. You could see it in the faces of those who lived by the northern winds, calm, resilient, slow to anger, quick to help. They were no longer called Vikings, but their spirit lingered in every kindness shown, in every storm faced with quiet determination. When the sea rose high in winter and battered the shore, the people did not curse it. They strengthened their walls, shared their food, and waited for calm. It was the same lesson their ancestors had learned from countless voyages, that resistance means little without patience, and patience means everything. Their survival was not defiance. It was trust. In their art, even the simplest carving or woven cloth held beauty shaped by restraint. The patterns no longer told stories of battles or gods. They told of balance, of symmetry, of respect for creation. To create was to honor the world as it was, not to change it, but to recognize its quiet perfection. Through their craft, they had learned humility. When travelers from other lands arrived and spoke of kingdoms and power, the people listened politely, then returned to their work. They didn't envy those who ruled or conquered. Their measure of success was peace, the steady rhythm of a life lived without regret. It was not ambition that guided them anymore, but gratitude. At dusk, when the wind carried the scent of salt and pine, the elders often stood by their doors and looked out across the land. They didn't see history. They saw home. Everything that once was, every journey, every storm, every loss, had brought them to this stillness. That was enough. Their ancestors had chased horizons. They had learned to cherish where they stood. Children grew under this quiet legacy, learning not through stories but through example. They saw how their parents worked, how they shared, how they rested. They saw that dignity was found not in pride, but in patience. And as they grew, they carried this rhythm forward, a continuation not of fame, but of peace. In time, the remnants of the old world sank deeper into the soil. Moss covered the stones, trees rooted where people once stood. Yet, the land felt full, not empty, not forgotten. It held everything that mattered, transformed into stillness. The legacy of the North was not buried. It was absorbed, like warmth sinking into wood, like light fading softly into night. When the wind moved through the valleys, it carried all that remained, the songs, the strength, the lessons of endurance. The sound was low and calm, a whisper rather than a shout. It reminded those who listened that what is good never vanishes. It lives quietly in what comes after. What they left behind was not empire or legend, but a way of living, steady, kind, and at peace with the turning of the world. And if you close your eyes now, you might sense it, the pulse of the land, the soft hum of what remains. The ships are gone, but their strength became the soil. The names are forgotten, but their patience became the people. What they left behind was not meant to be remembered in words, but to be continued in life. And in that continuation, they found their truest rest. Far above the quiet villages and frozen fields, the northern sky began to shimmer. It started faintly, a whisper of green brushing against the horizon, then deepened into waves of color that moved like breath across the heavens. The people of the north called it simply the lights. They no longer wondered what it was or where it came from. It was enough to know that it returned, year after year, like a promise of beauty in the long dark. The aurora did not speak of conquest or of glory. It spoke of endurance, of how the cold can still carry grace, and how even the longest night finds a way to glow. The people watched quietly, wrapped in wool, their breath turning to mist. No one applauded. No one explained. They just stood there, letting the colors pass over them like a calm blessing after centuries of motion. In the flickering sky, it was easy to imagine the past, not in faces or ships, but in light. Perhaps, somewhere within those shifting hues, there lingered a trace of all who had once looked up in awe. Not ghosts, not legends, but memories made of color and silence. The same light that had guided sailors home now shone upon farmers, shepherds, and dreamers. reminding them that beauty still belonged to the patient. Children often woke in the middle of the night to find the sky alive and trembling with color. Their parents would lead them outside, half asleep, to stand beneath the lights. No words were needed. The sight was enough, a moment of shared stillness between generations. It was not history being remembered, but gratitude being renewed. The world, they understood, still offered reminders of beauty for those who chose to look up. In those moments, time felt softer. The fields, the rivers, the forests, everything seemed to pause. Even the sea grew quiet, its surface reflecting the sky's slow dance. The people didn't take pictures or tell stories afterward. They didn't need to. The light itself was the story, one told not in language, but in peace. The elders sometimes said the lights came when the world needed to remember kindness. When the dark grew too heavy, the sky reminded people that even the coldest night still carries warmth, if only in color and silence. Whether that was true or not didn't matter. It was a comforting thought, and comfort, they had learned, was one of life's gentlest mercies. When the wind shifted, the aurora rippled faster, like waves of silk being pulled across the sky. The colors rose and fell with a rhythm that felt familiar, almost like breathing, almost like the pulse of the earth itself. The people stood quietly, their faces turned upward, their hearts steady. It was a rhythm older than words, and it needed no explanation. In the calm that followed, when the lights faded and the sky returned to darkness, the people always felt lighter, as though something unseen had been soothed. The stars returned to their quiet places, and the world exhaled. Even the animals seemed calmer, the night air gentler. The northern lights did not need to last. Their beauty lay in the leaving. It was said that travelers who had once been lost at sea had followed the lights back home, not because they led to safety, but because they led to hope. The people who stayed on land believed that too, that the light, though fleeting, reminded the soul to endure. It was not eternal. It simply came when it was needed, and that was enough. Every season brought new watchers, young eyes seeing the sky alive for the first time. They would stand in silence, hearts beating fast with wonder. And even though the elders had seen it many times, they watched too, as if it were their first. The sight never grew old because it never asked to impress. It simply appeared, humbling everyone beneath its quiet dance. The lights moved across mountains and over frozen lakes, reflecting off every surface like a quiet hymn written in color. It connected everything beneath it, the forests, the seas, the homes, the people. There was unity in that glow, the kind that doesn't need to be spoken about. It reminded them that all things share the same sky. When the first signs of dawn began to touch the horizon, the colors slowly thinned. The stars dimmed, the air grew still, and the people turned back to their homes. Yet even as the light faded, its calm remained. It stayed in their minds, their gestures, their voices. The day would begin again, work would resume, life would continue, but somewhere in each heart, a trace of that gentle beauty lingered. As the day unfolded, the memory of the light stayed quietly in the air. Even after the sun rose high and the colors faded from the sky, something gentle lingered. The snow seemed brighter, the air clearer. People went about their work as usual, but with slower steps, softer voices. It was as if the night had left behind a calm that refused to leave, a reminder that peace can settle even after the brightest beauty has passed. By evening, when the sky turned pale again, some would look toward the horizon, wondering if the lights might return. They never spoke of it aloud. They simply looked, hoping, patient as ever. If the night remained dark, they didn't feel disappointed. The memory was enough. The world, they had learned, doesn't owe wonder to anyone. It offers it freely, and only when the time is right. Sometimes, as the wind swept down from the mountains, the air shimmered faintly, and people thought for a moment that the colors were returning. But it was only frost, glinting under starlight. They smiled anyway. The light had taught them to find beauty even in what was small, fleeting, and quiet. They had learned that miracles are not always seen. Sometimes they are simply felt. The elders often said that the light was a mirror for the heart, that when a person stood beneath it, their soul became still enough to reflect what was good. Whether or not that was true, everyone seemed kinder on the nights when the sky came alive. Even children argued less, and neighbors spoke with gentler tones. Perhaps the light didn't just visit the sky. Perhaps it touched the spirit of everyone who looked up. Travelers who passed through often described the northern light as something impossible to forget. Yet for those who lived there, its value lay not in memory, but in presence. It was a gift meant to be experienced, not captured. No painting, no story, no song could ever hold it. The people accepted that truth with humility. To them, wonder was sacred because it came and went without staying. When the snow grew heavy, the light sometimes hid for weeks. The nights were long and dark, yet no one complained. They knew it would return, just as surely as the sea would rise and fall. And in the waiting, they found another kind of peace, the kind that teaches patience, that deepens gratitude, that makes the heart ready for joy when it comes. The light, when it returned, often came without warning. One moment the sky was black, the next it was alive. The villagers would stop whatever they were doing, carrying water, closing doors, feeding animals, and step outside. The cold didn't matter. For a few minutes, the world felt wider, softer. Even the oldest among them would stand still, eyes shining like the snow beneath their feet. The colors drifted slowly that night, green fading to gold, gold fading to blue. The movement was so gentle it seemed to breathe with the earth. The people watched without speaking, as if afraid that words might disturb it. The quiet between them was full, not empty, a silence that felt shared, like a prayer without sound. In that stillness, no one thought of the past or the future. There was only the present, the warmth of the moment, the pulse of the cold air, the shimmer above. It was enough. The light needed no meaning, no story to give it value. It was simply a reminder that peace can still be found, even after the world has forgotten its old names. When the last streaks of color faded into gray, the people turned toward home. Their steps were slow, their hearts calm. They didn't need to hold on to the light. It had already left its mark. They carried its gentleness with them, in their gestures, their thoughts, their rest. The light did not stay in the sky. It stayed in how they lived. In time, the people began to see the northern light not as a mystery to be solved, but as a reminder that the world, no matter how silent or still, continues to move with grace. That even in the longest winter, something beautiful can still appear without reason or command. The light didn't promise warmth, but it gave hope, and hope was enough. When morning came again, the snow shone brighter, the sea seemed softer, and the people moved through their day with quiet smiles. The light had gone, but its memory lingered in the rhythm of life itself. It was not a promise of forever, only a reminder that peace still visits, that beauty still returns, and that even in the coldest places, something kind continues to glow. There comes a time in every story when the echoes grow soft enough to rest. The people of the north had reached that time. The sails had long vanished, the songs had gone quiet, and even the sea had stopped calling their names. Yet, what remained was not emptiness, it was peace. The kind that settles when everything that once needed to be said has already been spoken. The world had moved on. New nations, new words, new lives filled the air with their own sounds. But in the far north, among the quiet hills and frost-covered fields, the silence was gentle. It was not the silence of loss, but of completion, a calm that comes when the work is done, when a story has fulfilled its purpose. The people who lived there no longer chased the past, they simply lived within it, like roots deep in familiar soil. The harbors stood empty, but they no longer looked abandoned. They looked content. The water lapped softly against the stones, carrying no longing, no memory, only rhythm. The sea had learned what the people had learned, that forgetting is not always an ending, but sometimes a form of mercy. To be forgotten is to be released from the weight of being remembered. In the small villages that dotted the coast, life continued in quiet cycles. Each morning began with the creak of wooden doors and the breath of cold air. Smoke rose from chimneys, curling slowly toward the grey sky. Children laughed as they chased one another across the snow, their voices rising into the open air where once the sound of oars had ruled. The same joy that once fueled exploration now lived in play. The elders, sitting by the fires, no longer told stories of the old days. They didn't need to. The stories had already seeped into everything: the way they spoke, the way they worked, the way they treated one another. The memory of the past didn't need to be repeated. It had become part of their nature. They carried it not as burden, but as balance. At night, when the world grew quiet again, the sound of the sea would return, steady, endless, familiar. It was no longer a call to adventure, but a song of comfort. The same sound that had once marked beginnings now marked rest. The wind brushed through the trees, the waves rose and fell, and somewhere in that rhythm, peace found its home. When travelers came, they found the place beautiful in its simplicity. They asked about the old legends, about the warriors and their ships. The villagers would smile and shake their heads. "We don't tell those stories anymore," they'd say softly. "We live different ones now." There was no sadness in their tone, only calm acceptance, like someone closing a well-read book and setting it gently aside. The forgotten past had become the foundation of their present. It was there in the shape of their homes, in the curve of their tools, in the patience of their hands. The old ways had not died. They had transformed into quiet wisdom, guiding every gesture, every word, every act of kindness. To the people of the North, that was remembrance enough. There is a certain grace in being forgotten. It frees a people from the weight of expectation. They no longer had to live up to legends or carry the noise of greatness. They were allowed to be ordinary, to plant, to build, to laugh, to rest. What had once been glory had become peace, and in that transformation, they found something deeper than fame: contentment. On cold evenings, when snow fell thick and slow, the world seemed to hold its breath. The glow of fires behind windows turned the darkness warm. The people gathered quietly, not to speak of history, but to share food, to share warmth, to share presence. The true inheritance of their ancestors was not the sea or the sword. It was the simple act of togetherness. The mountains that once echoed with war cries now stood in complete stillness. Their peaks caught the pale light of the moon, and their valleys held the soft hum of life. Everything that had once been loud had settled into quiet harmony. Even the stars above seemed closer now, as if bowing to the peace below. The people did not ask to be remembered. They did not carve monuments or write their names in stone. They knew that all things pass: names, empires, stories, and that this was not a tragedy, but the way of the world. The Almighty had made life to move in cycles: growth, fulfillment, rest. The peace of being forgotten was not punishment, it was completion. Children grew up without needing to learn the word Viking. They learned instead the meaning of patience, the rhythm of seasons, the value of kindness. These were the lessons that lasted, not written in books, but carried in hearts. The people had traded legacy for serenity, and they had gained more than they had lost. When the first light of dawn touched the horizon, the frost on the roofs shimmered like tiny stars. The people stirred slowly, kindled their fires, and stepped out into the stillness. They did not think of their ancestors or their history. They simply breathed, worked, and lived. And in that ordinary rhythm, they honored everything that had come before them, not with words, but with peace. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it, not the clash of steel or the roar of waves, but the sound of life as it should be: calm, complete, unhurried. The world had forgotten their names, but it remembered their spirit, not through stories, but through the quiet strength of those who remained. And in that quiet, they found what every traveler, every warrior, every dreamer seeks at the end of their journey: rest. As the years drifted onward, the land grew softer. Forests thickened, rivers shifted their paths, and the wind carried fewer voices. The old harbors turned to meadows, their stones hidden under grass and wildflowers. Nothing stood to remind anyone of what had once been, yet everything bore the trace of their hands, in the shape of a fence, the curve of a road, the sturdiness of a home. What was forgotten by word remained alive through form. The past had not vanished. It had simply learned how to rest within the ordinary. The people no longer looked backward. They had no reason to. Their hearts were full with the present, the smell of bread baking, the laughter of children, the warmth of firelight against the cold. History was no longer a story to be told, but a rhythm to be lived. It pulsed quietly through their days, humble and kind. The peace they knew was not built from remembering everything, but from knowing what to let go. When strangers came, drawn by curiosity or longing for old glory, the villagers welcomed them with food and warmth. They listened to the questions with patience, then answered with smiles that held no secrets. "There's nothing here but life," they would say. "That's all that's left, and all that's needed." The strangers often left puzzled, searching for ruins that were never meant to remain. They did not understand that the greatest legacy is not found in what endures, but in what allows others to move on. The mountains watched in silence. They had seen everything, the noise of war, the silence after, and the peace that followed. Now they stood untouched, their slopes silvered with snow, their peaks brushed with pale sunlight. The people worked beneath them as they always had, small but steadfast, shaped by the same patience that shaped the land. In this harmony, there was no sadness, only balance. When night fell, the same stars that once guided ships now watched over sleeping homes. Their light rested softly on the roofs, the fields, the slow curves of the rivers. The world had grown quiet enough to hear itself again. It was the sound of breath, of wind through pine, of the gentle creak of wood in winter. Nothing grand, nothing loud, just the quiet proof that life continued. The children of this generation did not dream of voyages. They dreamed of planting gardens, of raising families, of seeing another spring. Their imagination was rooted, not restless. The stories of their ancestors had done their work. They had taught humanity to move, and now they had taught it to rest. The lessons had been completed, their purpose fulfilled through the calm of those who remained. In every home, there was a fire that never burned too high, never too bright. It gave just enough warmth to fill the room, to draw people close. The flames danced gently, flickering across the faces of those gathered nearby. The world outside could be cold, but here inside, the air was soft. In that flickering light, peace was visible, not dramatic, but steady, like the heart of life itself. Sometimes, the elders would sit alone at the doorway, watching the snow fall. They did not think of years or generations. They thought only of the present moment, the quiet, the air, the simplicity of being alive. Their hearts were not heavy with memory. They carried gratitude instead, the calm understanding that every life adds something small and good to the world before it disappears again. The sea, once a restless companion, had grown gentle with age. It rolled and sighed, carrying no burden but the tide. Its waves touched the shore and withdrew, patient as breath. What once divided the world now connected it, drawing no lines between past and present. The people heard it at night, steady as a heartbeat, and slept easily under its rhythm. On clear mornings, when mist rose from the hills, it felt as if the land itself exhaled. Each new day was quiet, slow, deliberate. The fields sparkled with frost, the air smelled faintly of smoke and pine, and the sky spread wide and pale. The beauty of the world no longer shouted, it whispered. And those who lived here had learned how to listen. Visitors who wrote about this place often said it was too quiet, too simple. They did not know how much meaning silence could hold. For the people of the North, quiet was not emptiness, it was fullness. It was trust in the world, trust that what needed to be remembered would remain in its own way, in the air, in the soil, in the kindness of those who walked upon it. When the wind blew across the old valleys, it carried with it the faintest sound, not of song or speech, but of peace. It was the same peace that had taken centuries to grow, cultivated by hands that once built ships, then homes, then families. The world had not erased them. It had softened them into its rhythm. As night returned again, the stars appeared above the sleeping villages. Their light stretched across the snow like threads of quiet memory. The world no longer spoke the old names, but it still carried their lessons, that strength can become gentleness, that motion can become rest, that every ending can lead to calm. The story had traveled far enough. It could finally sleep. And in that sleep, the people found what their ancestors had spent lifetimes chasing. Not victory, not legacy, but peace. The peace of being forgotten, not as loss, but as return. A return to stillness, to simplicity, to the humble beauty of life continuing without need for recognition. The sea moved, the stars shone, the fire burned low. Nothing more was needed. The story of the North had come home. And so, as the fire burns low, and the waves outside fade into quiet, our story settles too. The journey that began with sails and storms ends here, in stillness, in peace, in the soft rhythm of a world that has finally learned to rest. The people of the North no longer chase horizons. They have found what every traveler seeks, the calm that comes when there is nowhere left to go and nothing left to prove. Tonight, you've walked through their silence, through the old harbors, the gentle fields, and the sky filled with northern light. You've seen how even the loudest stories can end softly, how even forgotten names can leave behind warmth. That is the quiet beauty of history, not its noise, but the peace that follows when the echoes fade. So now, as you breathe slowly, let the calm of the North settle around you. Imagine the sound of waves against the shore, the soft creak of wood, the steady wind that carries no hurry. Let it all drift further and further away, until only peace remains. The story is resting now, and so can you. Good night. May your dreams be quiet, your sleep deep, and your heart as still as the northern sea.